Russia had begun a buildup of forces near its border with Ukraine and also in Belarus in late 2021. The Biden administration released this information to the public, hoping to gather support and to have Russia condemned prior to any invasion attempts. Nearly 180,000 Russian troops were gathered along the north and eastern borders of Ukraine. Images of armor, missiles, and field medical stations flooded the internet. The invasion was imminent. Numerous conversations, press conferences, and meetings took place as the Russian force buildup continued. That December, Russia's defense ministry called on NATO to end its military activities in Eastern Europe and to pull back its multinational forces. The defense ministry also demanded that NATO formally declare that there would be no more expansion toward the east and that Ukraine would never be allowed to join. Vladimir Putin himself stated that any further expansion of NATO to the east would be unacceptable and said that he needed security guarantees for Russia. NATO immediately rejected Russia's demands and threatened Russia with more sanctions if it invaded Ukraine. In February 2022, French President Emmanuel Macron met with Putin in an attempt to stop Russia's plans. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also met with Putin and reiterated NATO's threats of sanctions. He then met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, imploring him to declare neutrality. Scholz attempted to cool down tensions by saying to the public that NATO had no plans to give Ukraine membership. Zelensky also attempted to downplay Ukraine's desire to be a part of NATO by calling it a distant dream. Scholz and Zelensky emphasized that Ukraine would complete the Minsk agreement process, however, saying that several years had passed and that violence was still taking place in the Donbas region. Russia called Ukraine's bluff. Efforts to avoid full-scale war failed completely. February 24, 2022, the day that shook the world, specifically the leaders of the current world order. Everyone thought that in the 21st century, world leaders were only supposed to talk and bluster. No one wanted an actual fight. No one was prepared to fight. But very early that morning, Putin made his now infamous announcement of a special military operation. His plan was to protect the people of the Donbas, who had been in conflict with the Ukrainian government since 2014. Putin announced that he would denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and called on the Ukrainian military servicemen to lay down their arms and go home. As Putin's speech ended, over 100 missiles rained down across every region of Ukraine. Kyiv residents were awakened by the echoes of explosions. The war had begun. Russian ground forces then entered Ukraine through multiple fronts. Paratroopers landed in Kharkiv. More troops moved towards Kyiv from the north out of both Russia and Belarus. Another series of divisions entered the Donbas from Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. Troops also moved in from the south through Crimea. Russian Marines conducted an amphibious assault near Mariupol. Ukraine declared martial law and banned all men up to 60 years old from leaving the country, compelling them to join the Ukrainian army. Combat took place on city streets and rural fields. Russians stormed areas throughout Ukraine with artillery, tanks, as well as guided missiles from naval units. Ground forces were met with resistance from unprepared combat units, despite Putin telling them to go home and live. One of the notable battles took place just north of Kyiv. The Hostomel National Guard Rapid Response Brigade responded to Russian helicopters converging on the Hostomel Airport. The Ukrainians were mostly unprepared because they had ignored all of the warnings, thinking that a full-scale invasion would never happen. However, they were prepared for a fight at Hostomel. The United States CIA had informed Kyiv that the Russians would attack the airport because of its strategic importance. Control of that area would have given Russia an air bridge just 6 miles away from Kyiv, allowing the Russians to quickly move a large number of troops and equipment to the capital city to seize it and decapitate the Zelensky regime. The National Guardsmen were garrisoned at the airport that morning, equipped with small arms as well as handheld anti-air targeting systems known as man-pads, which are a huge threat to helicopters. A squadron of MiG-29s and several units of self-propelled rocket systems were also sent to defend the airport. Over 30 Russian helicopters arrived that morning, a squadron consisting of Ka-52 attack choppers and Mi-8 transporters. The helicopters encountered intense fire from Ukrainian defenses, as several witnesses in the distance reported hundreds of Russian paratroopers engaging in an airborne assault. After losing a handful of aircraft, the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out of the airfield, seizing full control. As the paratroopers were preparing the runway for inbound troop transporter planes, Ukraine began a counterattack. A Special Forces Regiment, Armored Brigade, National Guard Brigade, and more Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft attacked the paratroopers, who had no armor or nearby reserve units. The paratroopers were surrounded and hit by artillery, forcing them out of the airport into the woods nearby. The Russians planned poorly on capturing the airport. They failed to assess the situation properly in regards of logistics, supplies, and how to land the transporter planes after the paratroopers captured the airport. They also failed to assess Ukraine's ability to quickly move reinforcements from nearby, and that the US would leak intel to Ukrainian leadership. This battle will go on for a few weeks, with the control of the airport changing hands multiple times. The Russians will ultimately win the battle and win control of the airport, but the Ukrainians did their best to destroy the runways and leave their enemies with a useless plot of land. The Russians remained in the area until they were given orders to move, part of a larger withdrawal agreement with Kyiv. Putin made a mistake, and that mistake was adopting a plan of incrementalism. Part of the reason why Putin went forward with incrementalism was because Putin didn't believe that the Ukrainians in the West were willing to fight. That led him to send only 180,000 troops into Ukraine. That number may sound large, but it wasn't nearly enough to take down the second largest country in Europe, and Europe's third largest military. Putin thought that by deploying a small force, he would shock the Ukrainians and his Western allies and quickly bring them to the negotiating table, while also not putting a very large number of his own forces at risk and spending resources on large mobilization. This strategy did initially work, even without the capture of Kyiv. The Russians and Ukrainians were negotiating a peace settlement that was disrupted by NATO, primarily the Americans and the British. Putin seemed to believe that NATO would have no interest in a continuously escalating ground war in Europe, especially knowing that Russia is the largest nuclear power in the world. But what Putin failed to realize was that the warhawks in Washington and London were more than willing to shed Ukrainian blood and to print endless money in their attempts to destroy Russia. He failed to realize that the concept of a nuclear Armageddon was far from their minds. The escalating nature of this war demands our immediate attention and collective action. The pathways to peace grow thinner and thinner every day. The hands on the doomsday clock move ever closer to the point of no return, to the destruction of the world. The war continues. If you like this video, leave a thumbs up, share it. Thanks for watching.